What? Send him in.
Hello there. The name is Eric P. Cartman. I'm a well-respected owner in the slave trade.
In the what?
My peaches, what a wonderful office you got yourself, y'all. Certainly got yourself a lucrative business, don't you? Well, let me get right down to it then. Like yourself, I'm also in the slave trade. But at the moment, I find myself in a little quandary with legal issues. Was wondering if you could share some secrets.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
You have some mighty strong-looking workers here, sir. I'd be willing to offer you $40 for 2 of the white ones and $50 for the blacks.
Are you referring to our student athletes?
Student athletes? Oh, that is brilliant, sir. Now, when we sell their likeness for video games, how do we get around paying for our student athletes then?
Look, there are good reasons why our student athletes cannot be paid, young man.
I ain't arguing. If they got paid, then how'd we make all our money, right?
We do not own slaves, and we have no desire to own slaves.
But of course you own slaves because... Right. Of course you don't have desire to own slaves, son. Neither do I. And if there was any government agency listening in on this here conversation, they should know that we're not talking about slave ownership at all. Alright, so now how do you get around not paying your slaves?
Get out. This is a prestigious university, and I am not saying one more word to you.
You think you can do whatever you want just because your corporation is a university? This country was founded on the ideals that one corporation couldn't hog all the slaves while the rest of us wallow in poverty. Screw you, sir. I'm going home.
Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the NCAA, and more specifically the pay-for-play issue that has been in the news over the past year or so. Now before I get into what I think about the situation, I wanted to go over the history of the NCAA and its transformation from this small committee charged with cleaning up college football to a billion-dollar business. The NCAA was started by President Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, football was nothing like it is today. It was essentially a blood sport. There were no pads, no rules to protect the safety of players. Injuries and even death were more commonplace than touchdowns back then. So the NCAA's mission was simple: clean up the game. And to a certain extent, they were able to do so. The game was less brutal and more fans were drawn to the game. But with the popularity soaring, the incentive for schools to win was larger. The more you won, the more people came to watch. The more tickets you sold, the more money you made. So schools started getting crafty. They started bringing in players who were unqualified to attend their universities. They brought in ringers. They started paying the top high school athletes to come and play for them. The game had gotten less dirty on the field, but more dirty off of it. Around the middle of the 20th century, the cheating in college sports had gotten out of control. The NCAA finally had enough power to do something about it. In 1948, the NCAA imposed the Sanity Code, which stipulated the amount of financial aid schools could offer its athletes. Now, while this may seem like it would hurt the schools, it actually helped them. Schools no longer had to pay top dollar for their athletes. Instead, it was the athletes who felt the brunt of the impact. They no longer had the leverage they once had. If they wanted to play college sports, they could only play in the NCAA. According to economists, the NCAA operates as a cartel. Now, a cartel attempts to maximize profits by reducing and limiting output payments, the same way in which the NCAA reduces output payments by restricting player compensation. The opposing viewpoint to this is that athletes get more than just the value of an athletic scholarship in return for their athletic contributions. USA Today economists Berkowitz and Weiner put the value of a scholarship at around $120,000 a year. To get to this figure, they included things like elite coaching, academic counseling, and medical care. Now, this may seem like a valid evaluation, but they fail to point out that both the athlete and the schools benefit from these perks. The players get elite coaching, which makes them better players, which helps them win the school more games, and helps to win the school more money. The academic counseling helps the players stay eligible and keep them playing and winning the school even more money. The free medical care keeps the players healthy and able to contribute and, well, you get the picture. So yeah, the players get these extra perks, but it is by no means a one-way street. Looking at the value of a scholarship alone may even be a misguided practice. Economist Andrew Zimblas, author of Varsity Green, contends that to calculate the true value, we should multiply the value of the scholarship by the graduation rate for NCAA athletes. So say a scholarship is worth about $30,000 a year, multiply that by 66%, which is the current grad rate, and you get around $19,000 a year. Because really, a scholarship only has value if the student athlete graduates, and considering the amount of time they spend devoted to their sports, about 30 to 60 hours a week studies show, the likelihood of that happening starts to dwindle. Student athletes are different from regular students, plain and simple. They have commitments that go far beyond that of any other student. Their value to the school goes far beyond that of any other student, and yet we expect them to succeed academically as much as any other student. The hypocrisy of how student athletes are viewed by their schools is remarkable. The schools expect a full commitment to the school from the athlete, while the schools themselves do not offer that same commitment to the athlete. If a student athlete does not meet the academic standards of the NCAA and loses eligibility, then they are no longer valuable to the school, and there goes their scholarship. Now, this is kind of understandable because, after all, the student gets the benefit of tutoring and other academic counseling, and they are in full control of their academic destinies, for the most part. But what happens if a player gets seriously injured and can no longer compete? Well, that happened to Kent Waldrop, a running back for Texas Christian University. Playing against Alabama, Waldrop was gang tackled and knocked out of the game. When he regained consciousness, he was told by doctors that he had been paralyzed. After 9 months, TCU decided they would no longer cover Waldrop's medical expenses, and he sued for workers' compensation. The courts ruled in favor of TCU on the grounds that Waldrop was a student athlete and not an employee. Now let's talk about this term, student athlete. It was created in the 1950s to help schools protect themselves against the likes of Kent Waldrop. The term came into play in the 1950s when the widow of Ray Dennison, who had died from an injury received while playing football in Colorado for Fort Lewis A&M, filed for workman's compensation death benefits. The school argued that Dennison's injury could not possibly be work-related because, after all, he was not an employee of the school. It was an accident that occurred during an extracurricular activity. The Colorado Supreme Court ultimately agreed with the school's contention that he was not eligible for benefits, since the college was not in the football business. If these schools are not in the football business, then what do they call the millions of dollars in revenue that they bring in every year? And these schools argue that they are not businesses when it does not suit them to be businesses, but when it does suit them to be a business, they change their tune. When confronted by the challenges of Title IX and other gender equality issues, the NCAA and its member schools want to be treated as a business. 80s argue that it's justifiable to put more resources into men's than women's sports because men's sports generate more revenue. But when the IRS knocks on its door, the NCAA and its member schools want their special tax exemptions as a part of their non-profit educational establishments, and they claim amateur status in order to avoid paying their athletes. The NCAA is unlike any other business in the United States today, in that it operates without paying its principal producers a wage. How can we justify such exploitation in this country at this time? Some justify it by pointing out that the athletic scholarship has provided an opportunity of education that some would never have had. They point out how the college experience is preparing these kids for life in our society. It is the exact same argument that Francis H. Hill had back in the 19th century when he said slavery had brought 10 million blacks from the torrid zone into this enlightened country, taught them a new language, and prepared them by association for citizenship. Now, obviously, these students are not forced to compete for these schools, but they are producing revenue and receiving next to nothing to do so. It may not be slavery, but it's close. It's time for the NCAA and its supporters to get real. It's time to lift the veil of amateur competition and expose the NCAA for what it is, a business, a very successful business at that. The NCAA has been able to hide behind terms like student athlete to protect themselves from terms like cartel and monopoly. These athletes are much more than student athletes. They're revenue-producing employees. It's time to start treating them like it. This may seem groundbreaking to shift from amateur competition to essentially professional competition, but it's been done before. Back in the 90s, the U.S. Olympic Committee oversaw the professionalization of their organization. Now, why, you ask, does this once exclusively amateur organization no longer claim the principles of amateurism? Mike Moran, USOC Director of Public Information, has an answer. He says they wanted to rid themselves of the hypocrisy. Hopefully, the NCAA is taking notes. So in conclusion, the NCAA has to start paying its athletes. It makes $10 billion a year. That's a lot of money. and it's time for them to start sharing it with those who are responsible for producing that.